morning. Wonder and transformation. For me, that is what draws a lot of us to SSE. It's what has drawn me to this field of exploration in general. And it, for me, started 20 years ago when I had my first out-of-body experience. I first became curious based on conversations with friends. That curiosity led me to read everything I could find. Some of it was scientific literature. So the work of people like Janet was instrumental, but then also experiential works, like we have Bob Peterson here, read his book, he played a big role, but so many others, William Baldwin, and so on. So once convinced that these experiences were not something fringe, in the sense that millions of people have been having them throughout history, that there was at least some indication that these experiences could be more than just in one's head, or at the very least that they provoked positive outcomes, then I decided, well, the proof is in the pudding. I just have to experience it myself. And once I did, it was quite transformative and addictive. So I kept trying to have them. And then that led to interests in bioenergy, biofield, and so on. That curiosity led me to the Pear Laboratory, where I was fortunate to see the laboratory towards the tail end and experience the interaction, potential interaction between consciousness or being and machines. That was particularly appealing to me as a budding engineer. I was still just first in high school, then in college. I thought that in order to promote this change, this transformation, this wonder and awe that consciousness can bring, the best thing I could do is engage in education. So I facilitated education and experiences through organizations like ICRL, IAC, and so on, as a volunteer while I was pursuing my engineering career. More recently, I have realized that the narratives that we are using, the applications that we are advocating for, are highly technical. They're of interest to us consciousness nerds here. But it's really a little boring or just mildly interesting for most people out there. And to me, that's unfortunate, because really I think millions of people can benefit from the work that we are doing here. So IACT, is a company I helped found, is just an attempt to experiment with these different narratives, to try to reach out to a broader audience. Of course, it won't go as deep as we go here, but it's sort of a doorway into the rabbit hole of Alice in Wonderland that we have here. So the approach that we're taking is that some of the things that we're studying here can be quite good for your well-being, right? They can help to provide insight into anything you do as well. So we think that obviously people that work in a healthy environment can have more development, professional and personal, and can enjoy more well-being. People who feel better perform better in terms of creativity, innovation, in terms of even less sick days, more productive, and so on. So as far as exactly what we're doing, we're trying to apply some of what we learn at conferences like SSE and through our own personal experiences and experiments to apply all of this for transformation, transformative techniques, technology for individuals, organizations, and communities as well. That might mean mentoring, training, or actual R&D. One way that we're trying to frame this emerging field of application is kind of piggybacking on the AR, VR craze, right? And calling some of what we're studying, the space where a lot of these experiences exist, as sort of consciousness reality. Sometimes I fear that we will encourage people to wear goggles and just sort of disappear into this virtual world, when we have within us a bottomless well of creativity, of innovation, and of genuine potential. And that's maybe, arguably, there's nothing more real than what's within us. So we want to complement AR and VR with CR, this sort of consciousness reality. And for that, we work with fellow organizations to explore these experiences and how these experiences might be beneficial to everyday people. And then we also work on technologies that facilitate some of these experiences. They might be apps, or they might be actual apparatus. Some of it uses vibrations, vibroacoustics to be specific, or other sort of sound-based technologies to provoke or facilitate the experiences. And others are just making sure that I don't have to be at 1,000 places at once to teach an OB technique, right? Now, we have been successful as a community to try to begin to show benefits of what we do, even if it's at a more superficial level. And big companies are paying attention to it. Even the US military is paying attention to it, just in terms of coping with stress and being more innovative and so on. Even in sports, you start to see attention being paid to things like mindfulness, biofield-related practices, and so on. And in my field, in a professional field, I'm an electrical engineer. Safety plays a big role, and it's known that for example, most injuries are due not to the inherent hazards of, for example, high voltage electricity. It really begins with states of mind, or mindlessness, to be more specific. So obviously, focus, calm, tranquility can go a long way. And that can represent saving lives and saving considerable sums of money. So that's all well and good. So we know that it can help well-being and performance, and that this is something relevant and is in the minds of business leaders all over the world. But the underlying mechanisms are still something that most people wouldn't feel comfortable talking about in a workplace, right? So it would be helpful to detect this energy and to make it something more mundane for the everyday world. That's just something part of the world. Now, you already heard about how you might be able to detect energy, and the lecture after me will also be related to that. And the difficulty remains, though, that just like it's difficult to show somebody an out-of-body experience, as McNamara discussed yesterday, it's also difficult to drag someone in a lab and show them about bioenergy. So as an engineer, I try to also come up with some sort of low-budget version of bioenergy, cultural transformation technology, something that could be easily done in a school science fair, for example, or at your home, and that, of course, could then be made in a lab as well. So at IAC, we are doing some sophisticated things as well, using fMRI. We have shown that bioenergy can be detected, at least some states appear to be detected with fMRI, and that things that don't appear possible have been showing up on fMRI. So when someone enters a particular energy state, like what's called vibrational state, this resonant state of feeling that your entire field is resonant, energy appears to go beyond the brain. It's something like you're not supposed to have brainwave activity outside your brain, but that's what the fMRI imagery appears to indicate. So that's just something I can discuss in a different venue, but that is something we're doing. But again, fMRI is very expensive. It requires people who are highly trained. It's hard to get your hands on it. So we are moving beyond that as well into something a lot cheaper and more accessible. So you can go to Walgreens or whatnot and buy some carnations, right? And so I just pick white carnations because they're easy to get. White just because it would provide contrast between the original healthy state and the wilted state. It will be visually contrasting. And you can essentially use these flowers as biological sensors of biofield. And you can set up an experiment whereby you have a few flowers. In this case, you can have 3 flowers, 3 jars. They're sufficiently distanced apart from each other, and they have the same amount of water, same amount of sunlight exposure, no additional nutrients, just the same amount of water. And you try to keep all relevant physical parameters the same. You can rotate the position of the jars, and one of these jars will be treated differently than the others. So the experimental jar would simply receive emissions of this intention. So yesterday we talked about attention units or intention units. We talked about biofield emissions. So however you want to frame it, you're going to have the user, the operator, the subject emit energy the best that they can, emit their positive intention, try to establish rapport with this flower. They might give it a nickname, and almost endear it as a pet, and just sort of ignore the other two. So that's pretty much what myself and a colleague did in university, just as a little pilot, exploratory thing, not really a formal experiment, but just to see if it was viable, right? And at the time, I didn't have my lovely iPhone camera, so I have really crappy pictures. I apologize. But just to give you an idea, right, that after, say, a couple of weeks, at the top, you have a normally wilted flower, which was the control, and then you have the flower that received the intention, right? So you see the most wilted flower in terms of the set of flowers that received intention, and the least wilted flower that did not receive any attention, just to be conservative. And still, it was visually striking. You could just tell that was a difference. Both my set and my colleague's set. So we thought it was viable, but that's where we left it. We said, okay, that was fun. It was a good personal experience. But then more recently, I've thought about how could we actually measure that? Could we come up with some sort of numerical assessment of that difference that is visually obvious, but it was hard to put a number to it? So by taking these photos, you could crop out just the flower without any background, take the largest crop that you can, and then you can run it essentially through a software program that will analyze the color, the pixels. And so I looked at the CMYK content of each sample and looked for how much black hue each one had. And of course, since one is darker than the other, there's an obvious difference in how much black content darkness each sample has. And this is an easily available algorithm. And so the idea is that we want to not just have experiences, and we want to also be able to quantify that as much as possible. So the attempt was to come up with some sort of measure. And it was also an opportunity to honor a mentor who spent a lot of time trying to measure some sort of influence that we may have over the physical world. And so we set out to develop a measure that was a ratio, unitless, but that would provide the proportion of difference between the treated and untreated samples. So the most basic kind of measure you could come up with is a ratio like this. Now, whether it's a ratio that measures an energy, a flow of information, of course, there are different models to talk about what the influence is, and I'm not here to discuss that right now, but I tend to look at it more as a transfer of information, but I'm not quite sure. I don't think everyone is quite sure what energy is, this biofield is. But we can quantify it in some fashion. And specifically to this flower protocol, you can look at the number of bits of darkness versus lighter pixels and come up with a measure. So just in a way of an example, right, for this set of flowers, we came up with a ratio of 25, and you can see there is some contrast. The one that had even more contrast ended up with a larger number. Now in the future, we're looking to improve on this measure, right? It's a common practice to use logarithms for this sort of thing, so we'll probably adopt something like that. That was one of the advices we also received from peer reviewers, from colleagues, people with more experience. And we are right now designing the protocol for a formal experiment, and we're going to conduct that with some help from some students and professors from different universities. And our idea was to just put this out there, receive as much criticism as possible ahead of time, and then implement that in our protocol. And so we don't waste anybody's time, right? So I think just based on the first explorations, it's going to be promising. And so we're making a number of considerations how to improve that protocol. Do we look at the whole flower? Do we look at individual petals? And then a lot of it is just defining precisely the conditions of the experiment so people can judge it, replicate it as well. And we're looking forward to the time where very sophisticated, high-budget technology that you heard before me and my low-budget versions can help culture to incorporate this concept of bioenergy, of the idea that consciousness can play an active role in the physical universe. And the hope is, of course, that this brings a different awareness to all of us, that we can all, through our manifestation, make the world a better place. And it's interesting to see that around the same time I was toying with this, that there was a viral ad by IKEA that showed one plant receiving sort of bullying messages and another one that was receiving very uplifting messages. Of course, this is also not an experiment, scientific experiment. It's more of a PR stunt. But it's interesting to see that through things like this, we can captivate the public, and it can be a way to sort of infiltrate the predominant paradigm, and maybe from within, we can start to bring some transformation in a larger scale, and that's our hope. I'd like to just invite you, if you do have any sort of consciousness-related technology, to reach out to us. And that's it. I'll be available afterwards.
Open for questions.
One more thing while we get our first questioner. We are developing some kits that if you'd like to try it at home, of course, this is fairly easy. You can do it yourself, but if you want a pre-made kit and instructions, just get in touch with us. Be happy to provide that later this year as well. Yes, Bob?
Thank you, Nelson. I very much enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you were familiar with, I know there was an experiment done several decades ago. I believe it involved Stuart Blue Harari, and in that experiment they used his cat.
Yeah, Spirit the cat.
Yes, Spirit the cat. And they had him travel out of body supposedly to his room, and they measured the number of meows the cat made per hour or something and used that to quantify. So I was wondering if you were considering using animals instead of plants, or doing some of those kind of experiments as well, as opposed to just plant-based.
Well, we are not at this moment, and I rather like to leave my cat to roam around. But I get your point. But the motivation behind this is something that can be easily replicated, low budget, right, and less red tape. And of course, anytime you use a human subject, animal subject, you have a number of considerations, right? So we'll probably steer away from that. But just from personal experience, I have a cat, and certainly I have, and my friends have dogs and so on, and they seem to be quite perceptive. Yeah.
Let me ask a question for really a point of clarification. When you talked about the fMRI, I may have misunderstood, but I thought you were sort of implying that it's measuring something way out there, where the fMRI is very much measuring what's in the brain.
Right.
It may be responding to what's out there. Could you clarify the point you were trying to make with the fMRI?
Right, so we wondered the same thing. So we originally had a subject in the fMRI, this is his brain, and he was performing a practice that leads to a state called vibrational state. And at the height of when he self-reported having the vibrational state, there was significant brain activity, but nothing anomalous really. But just after he stopped, not only was there typical activity across the hemispheres, then there were effects that were outside the cranium, even though he was unable to move his head. Then as a clarification, we said, okay, let's just put something biological but not a brain, like an egg, inside the fMRI. And let's stand outside of the fMRI and just emit the energy and then just see if we can reproduce some sort of an effect. And on a pretty much on-demand basis, emit, detect, stop, effect goes away. Emit, detect, stop, effect goes away. And this time, for example, with an egg inside the fMRI. So there appears to be some sort of interference effect when the person is performing the practice. Exactly what the nature of it is and how it works, we still don't know. And of course, we're working with different laboratories to do experiments so that we know it's not limited to a particular type of fMRI or a particular place. So we've done it in a couple of labs in Brazil, and we've done it also, I think, in the US. So right now we're collecting data. It's very preliminary, but it's exciting because there might be a way to, a very expensive way, but a way nonetheless to detect energy on demand, and that would be an important breakthrough for all of us.
All right. Are there any other questions?
Nope. Hey, Nelson.
Hello.
So Hideki Kokubo did some experiments with cucumbers, and that's not easy to say. What he was doing was trying to measure biophoton collection by the cucumbers and using them as sensors. He did one experiment where he laid the cucumbers out in rows and in depth around people who were doing healing, and then tried to see if there was a field effect. Have you thought of doing anything similar to that with your flowers?
I haven't, but now I will. Think about it.
Yeah, let's talk later.
All right, great.
Any other questions, comments? Thank you very much.
Thank you.